Thank you for spending Saturday morning talking about metrics. I hope you're sufficiently caffeinated. Who doesn't love the smell of metrics on a Saturday morning? So today I'm going to talk about the publishing metrics, and Fiona's going to talk about emerging author tools. Typically, this talk will take me 2 hours, but I've got to do this in 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do is tell you about the calculations, the pros and cons of these metrics, and how they should be used appropriately and how they have been used inappropriately. And with that, hopefully by the end of the day, you'll be able to walk away from here with a sense of what these metrics are actually trying to measure. So let's start off with that daddy of metrics, the impact factor. Hands up, who knows how the impact factor is calculated? We're in the right place. This is good. So every June, JCR, Journal Citation Reports, comes out with this league table of subject area dependent impact factors. And as editors, we look at these, and these are like our PhD results, and we want to see sort of where our journals are. How is the impact factor calculated? Well, it's calculated by taking citations from the JCR database from all journals to a target journal, citations to the previous year and the year previous to that. And then this is then divided by the number of substantive article types within that period. I say substantive because there are articles that aren't included in this figure, so it's not strictly an average, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. And this is how the calculator looks in practice. So you have cites to recent items. In this example, it's 737, divided by the number of recent items. It's very, very straightforward and simple. Now, why do we have this 2-year impact factor window? Well, the reason we have this window is because Eugene Garfield, this gentleman here who invented the impact factor, he was primarily looking at molecular biology and biochemistry journals, wherein he saw that the period in which the articles had the most impact were in year 2 and 3 after publication. So you have to take in mind that the impact factor was designed to measure these types of journals. It was never designed to measure a range of journals which we're using it for today. So some of the pros of the impact factor, it's fundamentally quite a sound premise. You get a bunch of articles and the citations to those articles over a period of time. You divide them out to create a pseudo-average. It's transparent, so you can go to the Web of Science database and pull out the data that is relative to the citations to these articles and to the journals. It's easy to explain. Now, this is quite important. I've been doing this job for a very, very long time, and every board meeting I go to, I have to explain how the impact factor works, because where we have these more sophisticated metrics, they're a little bit less transparent and more difficult to uptake by editors. It's efficient. We have this 2-year window. Now, if this window was 10 years, which may take into account, say, humanities journals, but we'll be measuring science or research that is 11 years old by the time we come out with an impact factor, and by then we're measuring research that is out of date. After 50 years of use, it's been established. Now, one of the problems with the impact factor is that there are differences in referencing behaviors between subject areas. Certain subject areas have more research over a certain period of time. There's more research, there's more references. If there's more references, there's more citations, so their impact factor potential is different among subject areas. So here we see history has an aggregate impact factor of 0.3, whereas the sort of biological journals, their aggregate impact factor is around the 5s. The target window itself isn't appropriate for all subject areas. So here we have Eugene Garfield's example, what he saw against the American Journal of Forensic Medicine, where you can see that using this 2-year impact factor window doesn't take into account the peak of citation for these articles. So this journal, using the impact factor, is at a disadvantage. So the golden rule with the impact factor is that you never compare journals across subject areas. Also, there are free citations. So we talked about substantive items briefly before. Now, not all articles are actually included in the denominator of the impact factor. So it excludes editorials, corrections, biographies, letters, and abstracts. Now, the problem is, if they get cited, they do count towards the numerator. So what happens then? You get free citations. So advantage is given to journals that publish a lot of this ephemera, because it's only going to get free citations. The more you publish, the more opportunity you have. So there's this thing called the ephemera effect with the impact factor. It can be gamed, and we've seen this. You can hide items from the impact factor using this ephemera effect. You can use self-citations to improve a journal's impact factor. Publishing more review articles or changing the composition of the journal can improve the impact factor also. We've seen cases of citation coercion, where editors are asking authors to add references. And more recently, there have been citation cartels, where bunches of journals are citing each other in an unethical way to boost each other's impact factors. One of the biggest arguments against the impact factor's use is that it has been misused to judge author performance. In some national research exercises, the impact factor was used to measure individuals. Now, in the recent, the prior ref, it was strictly written out that we're not using journal metrics to measure individuals or departments. But the problem is that we see a lot of anecdotal evidence that department heads are still telling people to publish in high impact factor journals, which may be incongruent to what the ref is actually measuring. So the take-home message here is that the impact factor measures the journal. It shouldn't be used to measure individuals. And Siegland's point kind of says it well here, that basically the impact factor is an average. So if you're measuring someone by the average of a journal, you're not actually measuring their actual input into the journal. So let's move on quickly to the SNP. Now, the SNP isn't something you go to the doctor for after you've had too many children. It's called the source normalized impact per paper. And this is an Elsevier product, and the reason that this metric is so useful is because it tries to reduce the variability in impact factors across subject areas. And how does it do this? Well, the SNP is calculated by the RIP, the raw impact per paper, divided by the relative database citation potential. Sounds very complicated, but let's break that down. So the RIP itself is a little bit like how the impact factor is measured. Average citations per article, has a 1-year census period and a 3-year window, so it's bigger than the impact factor. And only citations to and from citable items count. There's no ephemera effect, so it can't be gamed in that respect. Now, what's clever about it is we have this citation potential. So the idea is that having a citation from a journal is then divided by the number of references in that article itself. So you get a balance of the referencing behaviors between subject areas. And then that then is divided by the median citation potential of the database. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, here we have two journals from very different areas. We have a maths journal and a biological journal. Now, the citation potential for these two journals are different. So obviously, the maths journal has a lower citation potential, so its SNP is that much higher. And here we can see the SNP in these two journals, 3.8 for the maths journal and 4.0 for the biological journal. They are comparable dependent on the citation potential of the field. So that's the one that you want to use if you're doing high-level analysis and comparing journals across fields. The pros and cons of the SNP. The pros, there's no ephemera effect. You can do cross-subject comparisons. And it includes limitations of the database in its calculation, which a lot of the other metrics don't. So the cons, the citation capture window is 3 years, so it's going to bias certain fields. You could argue this is balanced against the referencing division effect. The calculation is rather complicated, so you can't pull it apart to interrogate the data, and therefore it becomes a black box technique, and people view it with some sort of suspicion at times. So I'm moving quickly, so apologize for that, but there's a lot to get through. We'll move on to two metrics that have come out almost sort of 10 years now, the eigenfactor and the SJR. Now, these are based on network theory, and the idea is that not all citations are equal. The idea is that if I'm cited by Time magazine, that citation is somehow worth more than if I was cited by my local newspaper. This eliminates internal manipulation. You can only increase these measures by being cited by a more important journal. And it normalizes for differences in citation behavior. Now, the way I like to think about this network theory is airports and flight paths. So imagine the airports themselves are the journals and the flight paths are the citations. The more the airplane goes to an airport, the greater value that airport is worth, or the more citations a journal gets, the greater value that journal's worth. So the eigenfactor, what are its characteristics? It doesn't normalize for journal size. So the problem with that is if you've got a journal that publishes a lot, it's going to have a greater eigenfactor than a journal that doesn't publish that much. So it's going to be very difficult to do cross comparisons. If you're doing absolute value for a journal, then it's probably appropriate for that. It's a one-year census citing a 5-year target window period, so it's bigger than the impact factor. So arguably, it could be a better measure for journals and subject areas that are slower, and self-citations are eliminated. In comparison to that, the SJR does normalize for journal size. It's a 1-year census period and 3-year citation window, and it only counts self-citations up to 33%. Now, some of the problems with these measures are they are extremely complicated. There's little transparency in the data. It is a black box technique. You get the number out of it, and you don't really know what's going on or how you can use it effectively, and you can't interrogate the data whatsoever. So although these are good for certain circumstances, they're not that informative to a journal editor in a lot of ways. So the idea that the impact factor especially was used to measure the effectiveness or the importance of authors led Hirsch to come up with his metric called the H-index. And what does the H-index do? Well, the equation is that an individual has an index of H when they've published at least H papers that have been cited at least H times. Sounds complicated in words, so let's kind of break this down into numbers. So here we have a bibliographic record for an imaginary author. He's published 3 articles. Each of these have been cited at least 3 times. So simply, he'll have a H-index of 3. We have author B. He's got 6 articles. But like author A, only 3 of these have been cited at least 3 times. So he'll only have a H-index of 3. So now we start to see that you can get authors with very different bibliographic records and highly cited papers, which the H-index isn't actually capturing those differences in bibliographic records. This is my citation profile. I'm very lazy. I only have written 2 articles, but I am a genius, so I've been cited a lot of times. Problem with this is that seminal thinkers may not publish much. So this chap here will only have a H-index of 2, even though his work has massive, massive impact. A few years ago, I measured Einstein's H-index, and it came out as 8. And so if you think that an associate professor in Germany probably has a H-index of around 25, so if you were a department head and you were looking at Einstein's H-index, you'd probably say, this guy isn't good, get him out, he hasn't got a high enough H-index. But he didn't publish that much. So how do you calculate H-index? This is my quick, easy way of doing it that I've learned over the years, is you get your bibliographic record, you make a count down the side and your citations to the right. You organize those citations by high to low, and then you look at the point at which your count is higher than the citations, and at that point, you go one row up, and that's your H-index. It's a very, very simple way of measuring your own H-index. So the pros and cons of the H-index. It's one single number. It's extremely elegant. It's great. It's efficient. You can measure this at any time. It's transparent. You can look at the data behind what you're actually measuring, which is very, very useful. It does remove the bias from the individually highly cited articles, as we saw in the case of author B, and it can be mobilized to evaluate a number of criteria. I've used it to measure journals, institutes, countries, and regions, although it was primarily designed to measure authors. Some of the problems with it are longitudinal bias. Well, what does that mean? That means that if you're a researcher who's had a longer career, your chances of having a higher H-index are that much greater. So a young researcher is likely to have a lower H-index because he has less work out there. There's no baseline. So if I've got a H-index of 8, what does that actually mean? Well, the only way you can measure that is to measure your peers' H-indexes and put yourself amongst them. Now, the problem with that is they're always moving, so you'd have to do that constantly. It can increase without you doing any more work. You can die, and your H-index can increase. Seminal thinkers, as we've talked about, may not publish a lot, and it's citation index dependent. If you're counting your H-index in Scopus, it's going to be very different than if you're measuring the same in Web of Science. So you need to be sure that you are comparing your H-index within the same databases. So Altmetric is a relatively new metric. They were beta testing this in 2012, and now it's rolled out on most Wiley platforms. What Altmetric does is measure the social media activity around an article. And it's measured by this thing up here called a donut, this thing here. And the colors represent the different media outlets that are talking about the article. And the number represents a measure of these outlets. So let's look at that in a little bit detail. The number itself is a weighted measure. So if you're mentioned by a newspaper, you'll get a score of 8, a blog 5, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, what you really want is the most colorful donut with the highest number. That's it. Now, with Altmetric, it's a great measure, and it can be used to measure sort of social impacts of journal articles, which is great. It's an article measure, which is another thing which is great for authors. So we had this case in one of my journals where Maria Sharapova announced that she was using meldonium. Everyone saw that in the news. And we published this paper a year before where they came up with a test to detect meldonium. And this became the center point for a lot of these news outlets. They wanted a primary research journal so they could cite to add some validation to their newspaper columns. Now, the problem is they weren't citing the paper for what it was actually doing, which was coming up with the validation and the methodology for testing meldonium. They actually just stripped out a bit of the abstract where it said that meldonium potentially has a performance-enhancing effect. So the thing here is that although it looks like a high score, a lot of the people that are actually using this aren't actually engaging with the content themselves. Altmetric is very good, but sometimes a tweet from a leading person in the field can be more valuable than being expressed in a newspaper if they're engaging with the content properly. So context is really the key when you're dealing with Altmetric. So that was a very brief tour. A bit of a summary. With the journal level metrics, should never be used to measure an individual. These are to measure journals themselves. The impact factor, you know, it's good for measuring journals, but you shouldn't measure journals from different subject areas. Be wary of measuring review journals against research journals as well, because they'll undoubtedly have very different citation profiles. The SNP is really good for measuring cross-disciplinary areas, but once again, shouldn't be used to measure author performance. The eigenfactor and the SJR, well, the eigenfactor, be careful if you're comparing journals, because if they're seismically opposed, you're going to get very different results. It's not very good at comparing journals with very, very different sizes. What it is good is measuring, if you want to measure absolute importance of a journal. The eigenfactor is quite good for cross-disciplinary comparisons. H-index itself is an author measure, or a more granular measure. So that's one for measuring authors, regions, departments, such like. And Altmetric itself is just an article social activity metric. It's great for tracking social media activity, although with it, be wary, because context is all important. So that's my quick whistle-stop tour. I'm going to be around for questions later, because this is just a brief overview. There's no way I can go into all of the debates here. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Fiona, who is going to talk to you about taking advantage of emerging author services.